It's time for another telescopic controller review, and this time it's coming from EasySMX with their new M05. This is a follow-on from their fairly popular M10 controller, and it stands as a very solid mid-range to budget option in the telescopic controller market. The M05 has an RRP of around $45 US, but I've seen it go as low as 25 to 30 on AliExpress. So we'll take a closer look at this controller, but before that I just want to say a big thanks to EasySMX for sending me this controller to review. As is my policy, they didn't see the video before it went live, nor did they have any influence over it. The M05 comes shipped in a pretty standard package, with just the controller itself and an instruction manual inside. I will say though, the manual is very detailed and tells you pretty much everything you'll need to know about this controller. And I gotta say, my first impressions of this controller were very positive. Although admittedly, I'm a little disappointed that they moved away from the Kishi-like design of the M10. Still, the controller feels very solid and pretty quality in the hands. It's actually shaped pretty similarly to the new Gamester X2S, and yet it still feels somewhat different from that controller. The build quality here feels pretty darn great for such a low-cost controller, and that's especially against its low-budget competition like the BSP controllers. Of particular note is the telescopic mechanism, which is very smooth and very sturdy. To be honest, I can't really distinguish a difference in quality between this and something like the Gamester X2S. It's really impressive for the price. In the center, you're going to see this smooth rubber, and on the sides you'll see that it's gilled just like the Gamester. And these gills basically improve the audio from your phone when it's in the controller. And they've also implemented a similar pivoting USB connector on this controller too. On the front of the controller, you're going to see these glossy face buttons, along with the EasySMX D-pad, which has a kind of odd shape to be honest. And then you'll see these two full-size analog sticks. On top you've got your L1 and R1, which are clicky mouse switches, and your full analog L2 and R2 triggers. The back simply contains two macro keys, but you can also see here that it has a kind of subtle grippy shape. So I'm just going to grab my phone and plug it in here, and we'll see what this controller has to offer. The first thing I noticed, unfortunately, is that my phone seems a bit too narrow for this controller, and you can see the edges of it flaring out from the top. This isn't a deal breaker, but I do wish it had a bit more of a cohesive look. By the way, you'll notice that this LED is yellow, and if you remove your controller and look at the part that slides out, it'll tell you what each color LED corresponds to, maybe X input or D input or iOS mode. I think that this is a really nice and helpful detail, and I think it was a really smart place to put it as well. And it even tells you right here how to change the mode. Very nice. Anyway, with my phone inserted, it's very rigid and sturdy. And the M05 seems to hold my phone with the appropriate amount of pressure. Not too much, but not too little. And right off the bat, I gotta say that it feels pretty great in the hands. The face buttons feel good, the analog sticks are good, and really I didn't have many complaints at this point. I was kind of in disbelief that you could pick this controller up for like £20, honestly. Although I will say that I did come in 4th place in Super Smash Bros. Brawl against 3 CPUs, so maybe that's a me problem or maybe it's a problem with the controller. I'll let you decide. Taking a closer look at these face buttons, I gotta say I really like them. They have a glossy texture similar to the Steam Deck, and a firm and thunky action. These are membrane-based buttons, by the way, and they feel really good. And I gotta say that without a doubt, these face buttons absolutely destroy those on the BSP controllers. Honestly, these face buttons are really nice. I like how chunky they feel even though they're membrane-based. The D-pad here is pretty big, but that's all it really has going for it. It's not particularly terrible, but it feels kind of flat, and it's also quite noisy for being a membrane D-pad. The actual button itself moves around within the shell quite a lot, and you definitely hear that as you play. Despite the flattish feeling, it does pivot on the center point, and actually in-game it performs incredibly well. I didn't have any issues with false diagonals as far as I could tell, and the input seemed really accurate. For example, in Tekken 3 I was easily able to pull off Yoshimitsu's backflip and his Moonsault Slayer move. And because this D-pad is so large and broad, it's really comfortable to use. So whereas I'd say it feels a little bit flat and a little bit loose, in-game it's actually perfectly fine. The L and R shoulders are just your typical clicky micro switch buttons, and they're unfortunately pretty noisy. They're also just a tiny bit too stiff for my liking. I've gotten kind of used to a mouse switch click on the shoulder buttons, and this definitely isn't that. But then they are responsive and not too bad at all. I do love how they spill over the side of the device and you can push them in from anywhere. The triggers react well in-game as well. They are fully analog, which again on such a budget controller is a nice touch. And they seem really accurate for my testing in the Gamepad Tester app and in a game like Rush Rally 3. They're light and easy to push down on and don't require an awful lot of pressure. and it's pretty easy to hold your finger at any point that you need to. The triggers also have something of a soft bottom out. It's not a hard plastic on plastic clack, but it's not silent either, it's just kind of a pleasant bottom out. The only problem with these triggers is that they do actually have a hard lip of plastic. And they're quite narrow as well, and I found while I was playing that my finger would constantly rub against this sharp edge. It's not sharp like it's going to cut you, but it's definitely uncomfortable. As long as I made sure to keep my fingers in the center of the trigger, it was fine. But as soon as I started pushing down on that back edge, it just got really uncomfortable really fast. Anyway, the analog sticks are about what I would expect these days. They work completely perfectly with no issues whatsoever. And despite not having anti-friction rings, they're still perfectly smooth at the outer edges. I didn't have any issues with cardinal snapping, dead corners, or anything like that. Overall, in terms of controls and actual gaming, I have very little to complain about the M05. In fact, I think it's a fantastic little controller, and especially when you consider its low price. Once again, the only real problem I have is that sharp lip on the triggers, but it's really not a huge deal. I would definitely prefer for the L1 and R1 shoulders to be a little quieter, but the great face buttons and analog sticks really make up for that, to be honest. The M05 also has a bunch of other features built in too, including the aforementioned different connection methods, including the ability to connect it to your iPhone, an adjustable turbo mode, and programmable macros too, which are super easy to set up as you play on the controller. And you can of course set up one individual macro per macro key. I'm not exactly sure how many inputs you get with macros, but I think it's somewhere around 17 or 18, and it includes all button and analog inputs. Although it does kind of feel like you get less macro if you use an analog input. For example, it seems like pushing the analog stick takes up a lot more room on the macro, as it were, than just pressing a button. But that's pretty much to be expected, so it's not a big deal. Of course, this controller supports the modern definition of small and large smartphones, which is great. But the new frontier in telescopic controllers is tablet support. And unfortunately, it's just not here on the M05. And trust me, I tried really hard to get a tablet in here. But not only did the spring inside break when I tried, but also the two halves of this controller are connected by an FPC cable, so you'd need to buy a longer cable, and it's just not really gonna happen. And that's even if you've already cut significant material off of the casing. Anyway, I'm not upset about this. And yes, what you're seeing on screen here is the M05 mod attempt of shame. I tried to replace a spring that broke, and I tried to get a bigger FPC cable, and none of it worked, and this is just kind of sad. Anyway, it is a real shame that this doesn't support tablets, and I really hope that EasySMX cottons on and makes a tablet-supported controller soon. But I'm not necessarily holding it against the M05 either, because they don't advertise it for being tablet compatible. And for its intended purpose as a low-cost smartphone telescopic controller, I think it's pretty darn great actually. Unlike the EasySMX X10 controller that I previously reviewed, I really don't have a lot to complain about on this controller. There's nothing really bad about it at all. I like the way that it looks, and I like the way that it plays. And I think it has just enough features for a budget controller. Add to that the pivoting USB connector that keeps your device safe, the high quality rubber that holds it steady, and just the general quality build and feeling in the hands, and I think EasySMX are onto a winner here. So let me just sum this up with my likes and dislikes. My biggest like is of course the price. I think that for the quality of the controller, the RRP is very reasonable. But then when you factor in the sales that have been going on recently on AliExpress, where this controller has been as cheap as £20 shipped, I think that's just fantastic. I also really like the build quality. I think for such a low price controller it feels great. And I like the white plastic that the whole controller is made of. I really like the face buttons, which I think feel absolutely fantastic. And I really like the full feature set this controller has. It has great turbo, macros, and supports a wide range of devices and input modes. And my dislikes are few and far between. It basically comes down to that sharp lip on the shoulder button, which I think is just a little too sharp. And then, whereas I think the D-pad is actually fine and it works well for everything, I do think it could be a little more tactile. All in all, well, I've already said this, but I think the EasySMX M05 is a fantastic budget mobile controller. And so if you're looking for something that's a bit cheaper than the Gamester line, and something that's much higher quality than something like the BSP controllers, the M05 is a fantastic controller to pick up. Once again, I want to say a big thanks to EasySMX for sending me this controller to review, and I'm going to leave links in the description box below, which you can check out if you're interested in picking up this controller for yourself. Definitely keep an eye out for sales if you do so. But all in all, the M05 definitely gets my thumbs up and my recommendation.